The Steadfast drifted through hyperspace with its hull scarred and its engines groaning. Yuna sat in the pilot's seat and stared at the swirling colors beyond the viewport without really seeing them. They had escaped 12 beings huddled in her cargo hold, 12 lives that would not be sold to the highest bidder, and one human left behind in the hands of a crime lord who would make him suffer for what they had done. Kirith appeared in the cockpit doorway. She moved slowly but with more strength than she had shown on the station. The few hours of freedom had already begun to restore something vital in her. "You are in pain," she said. Her voice was soft and musical, and Yuna realized it was the first time she had heard the Veloci speak aloud. "I am thinking about Deho," Yuna replied. Kirith walked to the co-pilot seat and settled into it carefully. "The other human who helped us." "Yes." Kirith was quiet for a moment. "He chose to stay. He chose to give us time to escape," Yuna said, and felt the ache in her chest grow sharper. "There is a difference. You will go back for him." It was not a question. Yuna looked at the young Veloci and saw no doubt in those dark eyes. "Yes," she said. "I will go back. Then he is not lost." Kirith replied, "He is waiting." The simplicity of that statement made Yuna smile despite the pain. "How are the others?" she asked. Kirith closed her eyes, and Yuna felt a gentle wave of sensation wash over her. It was different from the desperate broadcasts on the station. This was controlled and intentional and carried images and feelings rather than raw emotion. She saw the 11 other freed captives settling into the cargo hold. Some were injured, and some were traumatized, and all of them were exhausted. But beneath the fear and the pain, there was something else: relief, hope, gratitude toward the human who had answered when no one else would. "They are healing," Kirith said, and opened her eyes, slowly but truly. Yuna nodded and returned her attention to the navigation console. They were 12 hours from the nearest civilized port. She had already sent a message ahead requesting medical assistance and temporary shelter for refugees. The response had been cautious, but not hostile. "Can I ask you something?" Yuna said. Kirith tilted her head in that bird-like way. "Yes. On the station you reached out to everyone who passed your cage," Yuna said. "You broadcast your pain and your fear to every being who came near, and they all turned away." "Yes. Why did you keep trying?" Kirith was silent for a long moment. "Because stopping meant accepting that help would never come," she said finally. "And I could not accept that while I was still breathing." Yuna understood that feeling. She had stopped believing in rescue herself once. She had stopped believing that anyone would answer when she called. And then she had walked past a cage on a station in the middle of nowhere and felt something that changed everything. "What will you do now?" Yuna asked. Kirith looked at her hands. "I do not know," she admitted. "My colony was destroyed, and my family is scattered across the galaxy, if they are even still alive, and I have no home to return to." "You could stay here," Yuna offered. "On the ship, I mean." Kirith looked up with surprise. "Why would you want that?" "Because you have a gift," Yuna said. "You can feel things that others cannot, and you can help me find people who need answering." The Veloci stared at her. "I do not understand." Yuna turned her chair to face Kirith fully. "What happened on that station should not be possible," she said. "A place where living beings are bought and sold while the galaxy looks away because their cries for help are inconvenient. But such places exist throughout the outer systems." Kirith replied. "The relay is not unique." "I know," Yuna said. "And I cannot save everyone, but I can answer when I hear someone calling." Kirith's eyes widened as she understood. "You want to do this again?" "I want to try." The Veloci was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something new, something that sounded like purpose. "My people evolved empathy because isolation meant death," she said. "We were meant to feel each other and respond to each other, and that connection is what kept us alive for thousands of generations, until the galaxy decided your gift was a burden. Until they learn to block us out. Kirith agreed. But you cannot block us out. No, Una said. Humans never could. Kirith reached across the gap between their seats and took Una's hand. The touch sent a cascade of emotion through Una's mind. Determination and gratitude and fierce burning loyalty. I will stay. Kirith said, I will help you find those who cry out and you will answer them, and together we will prove that the galaxy is wrong about empaths. Una squeezed her hand. Together. 3 months later, the Steadfast had become the center of a small network of human pilots who patrolled the lawless sectors between civilized space. They called themselves the Answering. Kirith served as their coordinator, using her empathic abilities to sense distress across vast distances and guide rescue missions. To those who needed them most, Una had returned to the relay twice, but both times Grellis had moved Daho to a new location before she could reach him. She would not stop searching, an elderly alien scholar who had been among the 11 freed captives had written an academic paper about the phenomenon of human empathic response. He theorized that humans were unique in the galaxy because they had evolved not to filter emotional distress, but to act on it, where other species heard cries for help as noise to be blocked. Humans heard them as calls to action. The paper had spread through academic networks and then into popular media. Suddenly, humans were no longer the strange, aggressive primitives from a death world. They were the species that answered. Kirith sat at her station on the Steadfast and felt a familiar sensation tickle the edges of her mind. Someone was crying out. Someone far away in the darkness between stars was calling for help with desperate, hopeless intensity. She focused on the signal and felt its direction and distance crystallize in her awareness. Una. She called out. The human captain appeared in the doorway with a question in her eyes. Kirith pointed toward a section of space on the navigation display. Someone is calling. Una looked at the coordinates. They were deep in lawless territory, far from any support or backup, dangerous beyond measure. She smiled and changed course. Then let us answer. Somewhere in the void, a prisoner pressed against the bars of their cage and screamed into the darkness without hope. And somewhere in the void, a ship full of humans turned toward that scream, because that was what humans did. They answered always. The lights flickered once and then died. Una was already running before the emergency alarms began to wail. She counted the seconds in her head as she sprinted through the darkened corridors with only the red glow of backup lighting to guide her. Path 15 seconds. The holding area was 50 meters ahead, and she could already hear shouting as guards scrambled to understand what was happening. 20 seconds. She reached the main entrance and pressed the access code Daho had given her. Into the emergency panel, the door slid open, and she threw herself through before it could close. Again, 25 seconds. The cages stretched out before her in 2 long rows. Dozens of eyes watched her from behind the bars as the emergency release protocol activated and locks began clicking open one after another. 30 seconds. Una ran to Kirith's cage and pulled the door wide. The Veloci female stared at her with those dark eyes and for a moment did not move. Come on, Una said and reached for her hand. We need to go now. Kirith's fingers wrapped around hers, and Una felt a surge of emotion that nearly brought her to her knees. Joy and terror and overwhelming gratitude all tangled together in a wave of pure feeling. 35 seconds. Other captives were emerging from their cages now. Some ran immediately toward the exits, while others stood frozen with confusion and fear. A Drevni child pressed herself against the wall and cried silently. Una made a decision that went against every tactical instinct she possessed. Everyone follow me, she shouted. I have a ship and I am getting off this station. 40 seconds. The power began to flicker back. Emergency systems hummed as backup generators fought to restore full functionality. Una did not wait. She grabbed Kirith's hand and pulled her toward the service corridor that led to the docking sector. Behind her, a stream of freed captives followed. Some were fast and some were slow, and some needed to be carried by others. 45 seconds, the main lights came back on with a harsh buzz, and then the shooting started. Guards poured into the holding area from 3 different entrances with weapons drawn. They shouted orders in multiple languages as they tried to contain the chaos of dozens of escaping captives. Yuna pulled a small blaster from her jacket and fired at a guard who blocked their path. The shot hit his shoulder, and he spun away with a scream. "Keep moving," she yelled to the group behind her. Kirith stumbled, and Yuna caught her before she could fall. The Veloci female was weak from weeks of captivity, and her legs could barely support her weight. Yuna wrapped an arm around her waist and half carried her forward. The service corridor was narrow and dark and filled with pipes and maintenance equipment. It was also unguarded because no one expected captives to know about it. Daiho had chosen well. They ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The sounds of chaos faded behind them as they moved deeper into the station's infrastructure. Yuna counted 11 others following her. 11 frightened beings who had chosen to trust a human. They did not know the docking sector appeared. Ahead, Yuna could see the familiar shape of her ship through the observation windows, and standing between them and the airlocks was a massive figure that made her blood run cold. Grellis himself, the crime lord who owned the relay, stood nearly 3 meters tall with gray-green scales and eyes like yellow pits of malice. He was surrounded by a personal guard of 8 heavily armed soldiers. "Human," Grellis said in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, "you have caused considerable damage to my property." Yuna pushed Kirith behind her and raised her blaster. "These people are not property." Grellis laughed, and the sound echoed through the corridor. "Everything on this station is my property," he replied, "including you now." The guards raised their weapons. Yuna felt Kirith's hand grip the back of her jacket. She felt the wave of terror washing off the Veloci female, and the 10 others huddled behind her. She should have been afraid. She was afraid, but she had spent 7 years living with the weight of doing nothing, and she refused to carry that burden again. "You want to know why I am here?" Yuna asked. Grellis tilted his massive head. "Enlighten me." "Because she called for help," Yuna said, and gestured at Kirith. "Because she screamed into the void for weeks and nobody answered except me." "Sentiment," Grellis spat. "Foolish human sentiment that will get you killed." "Maybe," Yuna admitted, "but at least I answered." The explosion rocked the corridor behind Grellis. The crime lord spun as one of his guards flew past him and crashed into the wall. Daiho emerged from a side passage with a heavy assault rifle in his hands and fire in his eyes. "Go," he screamed at Yuna. "I will hold them." Grellis roared, and his remaining guards turned to face the new threat. Yuna did not hesitate. She grabbed Kirith and ran. The freed captives followed in a desperate sprint toward the airlock. Behind them, weapons fire lit up the corridor as Daiho fought alone against impossible odds. Yuna reached her ship and slammed her palm against the access panel. The airlock cycled open, and she shoved Kirith inside. "Everyone in now." The captives poured through the entrance in a wave of fur and feathers and scales. Yuna counted them as they passed 11. All 11 had made it. She turned back to look for Daiho. He was pinned behind a cargo container with 3 guards closing in on his position. Grellis stood behind them, with blood dripping from a wound on his arm and murder in his eyes. Daiho met Yuna's gaze across the distance. He shook his head once. "Go." He mouthed. Yuna felt tears burn in her eyes. "I will come back for you," she shouted. Daiho smiled. Then he stood from cover and charged directly at Grellis with his rifle blazing. Yuna sealed the airlock and ran for the cockpit. Her hands moved across the controls with desperate speed as she activated the engines and released the docking clamps. The Steadfast shuddered as it pulled away from the station through the viewport. Yuna could see weapons fire chasing her ship. She pushed the engines to maximum and dove toward the jump threshold behind her in the cargo hold. Kirith sent out a wave of emotion. It was not fear this time. It was hope, fierce and burning and unstoppable hope. The stars stretched into lines as the hyperdrive engaged and the relay disappeared behind them like a bad dream. The security sector of the relay station was cleaner than the rest of the facility, but no less threatening. Yuna walked through the corridors with a datapad in her hand and a forged maintenance badge clipped to her jacket. She had spent 12 hours gathering information and mapping the station's layout from public terminals and overheard conversations. Now she needed to see the security systems firsthand. She turned a corner and nearly walked into a human male and a station security uniform. They both stopped and stared at each other for a moment. Yuna had not expected to find another human on this station. The man was tall and broad with a military bearing and eyes that held exhaustion and something that looked like shame. "You are not maintenance," he said quietly. Yuna considered running, but something in his voice made her pause. "No," she admitted. "I am not." The man looked down the corridor in both directions before grabbing her arm and pulling her into a side room. It was a storage closet filled with cleaning supplies and spare parts. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Yuna studied his face and saw the tension in his jaw and the way his hand trembled slightly at his side. "What are you doing here?" she asked instead of answering. "Working security for a slave market." The man flinched as if she had struck him. "I took the job before I knew what this place was," he said. "The pay was good and I had debts, and I did not ask enough questions. But you stayed." His eyes dropped to the floor. "Leaving is not simple," he said. "They do not let security personnel just walk away, and I have seen what happens to people who try." Yuna felt some of her hostility drain away. This man was trapped too, just in a different kind of cage. "My name is Yuna Park," she said. "Daeho Shin," he replied. "Sergeant Daeho Shin if titles matter here." "They do not." Daeho almost smiled at that. "So I ask again," he said. "What are you doing sneaking into the security sector with a fake badge?" Yuna made a decision that might have been foolish but felt right. "There is a Veloci female in the holding cells," she said. "Her name is Kirith, and she is going to be sold at auction in 2 days, and I'm going to get her out before that happens." Daeho stared at her. "You are insane." "Probably. The holding facility has 20 guards on rotation at any given time." Daeho continued. "The cages are individually locked with biometric seals, and the entire section has independent power systems, specifically designed to prevent this exact scenario. Then I will need help from someone who knows the security systems," Yuna said, and held his gaze. Daeho shook his head slowly. "I am not getting involved in this." "You are already involved," Yuna replied. "You have been involved since the first day you put on that uniform and watched people get sold like cargo. You do not understand the risks. I understand that a young woman is sitting in a cage, broadcasting her terror to a galaxy that has decided not to listen," Yuna said, and let her anger show now. "I understand that she's been calling for help for weeks, and everyone who could hear her chose to walk away." Daeho's face twisted with something painful. "The empaths," he said quietly. "I can feel them. When I patrol the holding area and I have to take medication just to sleep at night because their fear follows me everywhere. Then help me make it stop." Daeho pressed his palms against his eyes. "This is suicide. When did we become the species that watches and does nothing?" Yuna asked. "When did we learn to walk past suffering and pretend we cannot hear it?" The question hung in the air between them. Daeho lowered his hands and looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "I joined the military when I was 18 because I believed humans were supposed to protect people," he said. "I believed we were the ones who answered calls for help, and I was proud of that. What happened?" "That happened," he said bitterly. "Bad decisions and worse luck, and one day I woke up working for slavers because the money was too good to refuse." Yuna stepped closer to him. "You can still be the person you believed you were," she said. You can still answer. Deho was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out his own datapad and began typing. The power grid has a vulnerability, he said without looking up. If the main distribution hub experiences a cascading failure, the backup systems take 45 seconds to fully restore power. Yuna felt hope surge in her chest. 45 seconds is not much time. It is enough time to reach the holding cells and trigger the emergency release on the cages. Deho continued. The biometric locks default to open when power is lost as a fire safety protocol. How do we trigger the cascade? Deho looked up at her. I can do it from the engineering section, but once I trigger the failure, they will know it was sabotage, and they will know it was me. Then you need to be on my ship when the power comes back on. Deho shook his head. The timing is too tight, and someone needs to hold the engineering access point, or the system will autocorrect. Before full cascade, Yuna understood what he was saying. He was offering the sacrifice himself. No, she said firmly. We find another way. There is no other way, Deho replied. Not in 2 days. Yuna grabbed his arm. I'm not leaving you behind. Deho smiled, and it was the first genuine expression she had seen on his face. Then come back for me, he said. After you get the Veloci and whoever else you can save off this station, you come back with help and you find me. That could take weeks. I have survived this long. Yuna wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in his eyes. He had made his choice. Tomorrow night, she said finally. The auction is in 2 days, so we move tomorrow when the preparation shifts are understaffed. Deho nodded and handed her his datapad. This has the patrol schedules and access codes you will need. Yuna took the device and held it tightly. Thank you. Do not thank me yet, Deho said. Thank me when you are in hyperspace with that girl and everyone else you can carry. He opened the storage room door and checked the corridor. Go, he said. I will find you tomorrow before the shift change. Yuna slipped past him and walked toward the exit with her heart pounding behind her. Deho watched her go and felt something he had not experienced in years, pride in being human. Yuna sat in the cargo hold of her ship and stared at the wall for a long time. The mechanic had given her the estimate 3 hours ago. 2 days for repairs, and a cost that would drain most of her remaining credits. She would have just enough left to buy fuel and food for the journey to the nearest civilized port. She would have nothing left for anything else. Certainly nothing left to buy a slave at auction. The word made her stomach turn. Slave Kirith was a person affrighted and desperate. Person trapped in a cage because the galaxy had decided her pain was not worth acknowledging. Yuna closed her eyes and felt the echo of that empathic wave still lingering in her mind. She had never experienced anything like it before the Veloci. Species was not common in the sectors where Yuna usually worked. She knew little about them except that they were empaths and that their homeworld had been raided repeatedly by slavers who prized their abilities. Yuna pulled up her console and searched for information about empathic species in the Galactic database. What she found made her anger burn hotter. Most species had evolved natural barriers against empathic projection. They experienced the emotions as an intrusion and an unwanted violation of their mental privacy. They reacted by blocking out the signal and turning away from the source. This was considered normal and healthy behavior by galactic standards. The database entry noted that prolonged exposure to empathic distress signals could cause discomfort in non-empathic species and recommended avoiding contact with distressed empaths when possible. Yuna read that line 3 times before she understood what it really meant. The galaxy had decided that empathic cries for help were a nuisance. The galaxy had decided that the correct response to someone broadcasting their pain was to block it out and walk away. And because every other species had evolved this defense mechanism, the empaths themselves had become invisible. Their suffering was loud and constant, and everyone had learned to tune it out like background noise. Except humans. Humans had no natural mental barriers. Humans heard every cry and felt every wave of emotion and could not simply choose to ignore it. Yuna thought about the way other beings had flinched when they walked past Kirith's cage. They had felt her pain. They had simply decided not to care. A knock on her airlock pulled Yuna from her thoughts. She checked the external camera and saw a Tarvani merchant standing outside, the same one who had greeted her at the docks. She opened the airlock with caution and kept one hand near the weapon on her hip. "Human," the merchant said again with that same distasteful tone. "I saw you speaking with the Veloci at the market. Is that a problem?" Yuna asked. The merchant shook his head, and all four of his arms moved in a gesture that might have been dismissal. "Not a problem, but perhaps an opportunity for wisdom," he replied. "I have been on this station for 15 cycles, and I have seen many species come and go, and I have learned which ones cause trouble and which ones understand their place. What is your point?" "My point is that humans always cause trouble," the merchant said with something that sounded almost like respect. "You cannot help yourselves, and I have watched humans throw away fortunes and freedom and lives trying to fix things that are not their concern." Yuna felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice calm. "Maybe some things should be everyone's concern." The merchant laughed. It was not a cruel sound exactly, but it carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and stopped caring. "Long ago, the empaths are burdens," he said. "Their emotional noise drives away customers and makes everyone uncomfortable. And they are sold cheaply because nobody wants to be near them for long, except the worst kinds of buyers." Yuna felt cold. "What kinds of buyers?" "The merchants." I shifted away for a moment. "The kinds who enjoy feeling fear and pain and desperation," he said quietly. "The kinds who find pleasure in someone else's suffering broadcast directly into their minds." Yuna's hands curled into fists. "Leave," she said. The merchant blinked at her. "I am trying to help you understand the situation. I understand it perfectly." Yuna replied, "Now leave my ship." The merchant raised all four hands in surrender and backed away from the airlock. "Remember what I said, human," he called out as the door began to close. "This is not your world, and these are not your rules. And you cannot change anything here." The airlock sealed and Yuna stood in silence for a long moment. She thought about Kirith's hand pressed against the bars. She thought about the gratitude that had washed over her when she simply stopped and listened. She thought about Kepler Station 7 years ago and the family she had failed to save. She could not buy Kirith's freedom, but purchase was not the only way to acquire something. Yuna walked to her personal storage locker and pulled out the case hidden at the bottom. Inside were tools and credentials and devices she had acquired during her years as a cargo pilot. Some of them were legal. Most of them were not. She had never used them for anything more than smuggling cargo past customs checkpoints. She had never used them to break into a heavily guarded facility and steal a living person out of a cage. But there was a first time for everything. Yuna began to plan. She needed information about the security systems and guard rotations and power distribution across the station. She needed to find someone on the inside who might be willing to help, and she needed to do all of this in less than 3 days before the auction that would send Kirith to whatever monster had the highest bid. The odds were terrible. The plan was barely formed, and Yuna had never felt more certain of anything in her life. She was going to answer the cry that everyone else had ignored. She was going to open that cage, or she was going to die trying. The relay station hung in the darkness between stars, like a tumor growing where no law could reach. At Unipark guided her damaged ship toward the docking clamps and whispered a curse under her breath as warning lights flickered across her console. The hyperdrive had failed 3 jumps ago, and she had limped through empty space for 6 days. Before finding this station on her emergency beacon scanner, she did not know what kind of place this was. She only knew she needed repairs or she would Die alone in the void. The docking procedure took 20 minutes and cost her 300 credits just for the privilege of connecting to the station. A Torvani merchant met her at the airlock with 4 arms crossed over his chest and eyes that held no warmth. Human, he said, as if the word itself tasted unpleasant. My hyperdrive is damaged. Yuna replied and kept her voice steady despite her exhaustion. I need a mechanic and parts. The Torvani looked her up and down before pointing one long finger toward a corridor on the left. Mechanic district is that way, but repairs take time here and time costs money. Yuna thanked him and stepped into the station. The smell hit her first. It was a mixture of recycled air and something else beneath it. Something that reminded her of fear and desperation and unwashed bodies packed too close together. She walked through the first market section and saw nothing unusual at first glance. Vendors sold food and ship parts and weapons and medicine. Aliens of a dozen species moved through the crowds with purpose. Then she turned a corner and stopped breathing. Cages lined both walls of the corridor. Inside each cage sat a living being. Some were small and huddled in corners, while others pressed against the bars with hollow eyes. A Drevni child no older than 5 cycles clutched the bars and stared at nothing. A massive Corvan male sat with his back to the corridor, as if refusing to acknowledge his captivity. And in a cage near the middle of the row there was a creature Yuna had never seen before. She was small and delicate, with features that seemed somewhere between avian and mammalian. Soft feathers covered her arms and the sides of her face, while her body was wrapped in torn fabric that might once have been beautiful clothing. Her eyes were large and dark and filled with something that made Yuna's chest tighten. The creature opened her mouth and made a sound that was not quite speech, but it was not the sound that reached Yuna. It was something else entirely. A wave of emotion crashed into Yuna's mind with the force of a physical blow. Desperation and loneliness and terror and the exhausted hope of someone who had screamed for help 1,000 times and received no answer. Yuna stumbled and caught herself against the wall. She watched as other beings walked past the cages without even glancing at the captives inside. A Tovani merchant passed within arm's reach of the feathered creature and visibly flinched. Before walking faster, a pair of Grellis traders looked at the cages with calculating eyes, but moved on when the emotional wave touched them. Everyone felt it. Everyone turned away. Yuna understood in that moment what this place truly was. She understood that she had stumbled into one of the slave markets that existed in the lawless spaces between civilizations. She understood that the creature in the cage was calling for help with every fiber of her being, and that the galaxy had learned to ignore such calls. The smart thing to do was walk away, find the mechanic district, and get her ship repaired, and leave this place behind as quickly as possible. One human with a damaged freighter could not change anything here. One human could not save anyone. Yuna had learned that lesson before. She had learned it on Kepler Station 7 years ago, when she watched security forces drag a family away and did nothing, because getting involved meant risk and pain and failure. That family had died. Yuna had lived. She had carried the weight of that choice ever since her feet moved before her mind could stop them. She walked toward the cage where the feathered creature sat and crouched down until they were at eye level. The emotional broadcast intensified pain and confusion and desperate yearning hope, all tangled together in a wave that made Yuna's eyes water. Hey, Yuna said softly. I can hear you. The creature's dark eyes widened. Her mouth opened and closed several times, as if she had forgotten how to respond when someone actually answered. A guard noticed Yuna crouching by the cage and walked over with his weapon visible on his hip. You interested in buying? He asked with a bored tone. I am looking. Yuna replied without taking her eyes off the creature. Valasi female, the guard said and gestured at the cage. Young and healthy despite appearances, and her empathic abilities make her valuable for certain Clientele, if you understand my meaning. Yuna felt sick. How much? She asked. The guard named a price that was more than Yuna's ship was worth. More than everything she owned combined. That is the reserve. The guard continued. Auction is in 3 days, and she will likely go for twice that amount. Yuna nodded slowly and forced herself to stand. I will think about it, she said. The guard shrugged and walked away. Yuna looked down at the Veloci. Female, one more time. What is your name? She asked. The creature tilted her head, and Yuna felt a gentle touch against her mind. Not words exactly, but a sensation that carried meaning. Kirith. The name was Kirith. Kirith. Yuna repeated aloud. My name is Yuna. Kirith pressed one delicate hand against the bars of her cage. Her emotions shifted from desperate pleading to something more fragile. Hope, terrified and uncertain hope. I cannot buy you, Yuna admitted and watched that hope flicker like a candle in wind. I do not have that kind of money. Kirith's hand did not withdraw from the bars. Her eyes did not look away. Yuna felt another wave of emotion, but this one was different. It was not a plea for rescue. It was gratitude. Simple and pure and overwhelming. Gratitude that someone had stopped, that someone had listened, that someone had answered. 3 days. Yuna said quietly. You said the auction is in 3 days. She was not speaking to Kirith anymore. She was speaking to herself. 3 days was not much time, but it was time. Yuna turned and walked toward the mechanic district with a purpose she had not felt in 7 years. Behind her, the Veloci female named Kirith watched her go. And for the first time since her capture, Kirith allowed herself to believe that someone might actually come back.